Take the $50 and leave before I call security. The bill did not land in Mason Cole's hand. It fluttered once in the hot wind of the private jet hangar, slapped against the polished concrete, and slid beneath the toe of his worn work boot like trash. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The white private jet behind them sat under the lights like a sleeping animal, its chrome stairs lowered, its left engine open, its glossy body reflecting the suits, the cameras, the pilots, and the woman standing in front of Mason with her chin lifted like the whole airport belonged to her. Her name was Evelyn Hartwell. To the public, she was a private aviation heiress, a woman who could buy silence, loyalty, and speed.
"I said take it," Evelyn snapped. "That is more than enough for a man who was asked to tighten one panel and decided to scare my flight crew with nonsense."
A few people laughed, not loudly. Rich people rarely laughed loudly when they wanted to be cruel. They smiled through their teeth. They looked away. They let the humiliation breathe. Mason crouched beside an old metal toolbox, his shirt stained with engine grease, his hands rough and cracked, his face tired from a life that had not waited for him to catch up. Beside him, his 8-year-old daughter Lily clutched the sleeve of his work jacket. She was trying not to cry. Mason saw that first. Not the money, not Evelyn's face, not the 2 security guards stepping closer. He saw Lily's fingers tighten around his sleeve, small knuckles white, and something in his expression changed. He lowered his eyes to the concrete. There, near the open tool panel, lay a single missing screw. Tiny, dark, almost invisible against the floor. Everyone else saw a screw. Mason saw a warning. He reached for it. "Don't touch my aircraft again," Evelyn said. Mason froze with 2 fingers an inch from the screw. The chief pilot, a silver-haired man with a headset around his neck, gave a nervous smile. "Miss Hartwell, we are already behind schedule."
"Then close the panel and get me in the air."
Mason slowly stood. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the hangar. "If that jet takes off like this, it won't come back the same way." The laughter stopped. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" Mason held up the screw between 2 grease-blackened fingers. This didn't fall out. It was left out. One of the engineers scoffed. "That's a standard access screw. We've checked the system twice." Mason didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on the jet. "No," he said. "You checked what the computer told you to check." Evelyn stepped closer. Close enough that the scent of expensive perfume cut through the smell of fuel and hot metal.
"You are a temporary mechanic with a borrowed badge," she said. "Do not lecture my crew in front of my guests."
Then she turned to security. "Get him out." One guard took Mason's toolbox. The other reached for his arm. Lily whispered, "Dad?" Mason did not resist. He only looked once more at the left engine, at the open panel, at the place where the missing screw should have been. And under his breath, so softly only Lily heard him, he said, "That sound is wrong." If you've ever been judged by your clothes, your job, your accent, your bank account, or the tired look on your face after doing everything you can just to survive, then this story is for you. Sometimes the person everyone dismisses is the only one still paying attention. And sometimes one tiny detail, something everyone else steps over, can stop a disaster worth millions. 3 days earlier, Mason Cole had been standing in a grocery store with $12.17 in his checking account, deciding whether to buy cough syrup for his daughter or gas for the truck. He chose the cough syrup. He always chose Lily. The cashier knew him by now. A quiet man with tired eyes, a faded denim work shirt, and a little girl who always said thank you even when they bought the smallest items in the store. Mason never complained. He never asked for credit. He never looked angry at the world, though the world had given him enough reason. His wife, Anna, had died 2 years before. Not dramatically, not in a way people made speeches about, but slowly, from a sickness that drained their savings one appointment at a time. Mason had sold the house first, then the second truck, then most of the tools he had spent 15 years collecting. What remained fit in one metal toolbox, and still, every morning he packed Lily's lunch, braided her hair badly but with care, and told her the same thing at the door. Walk tall. "Đi phần 3, phần 4," she would smile and say. "Even when people don't see me?" especially then. Before everything fell apart, Mason had worked aircraft maintenance for a regional aviation contractor. He was not famous. He was not rich. But among people who understood machines, he had a reputation for hearing problems before instruments saw them. Engines spoke to him in rhythm, vibration, heat, and smell. Then came the accident. A luxury charter had suffered a mechanical failure after maintenance work Mason had warned against rushing. The company blamed him. The report buried his notes. The supervisor who signed off on the final clearance kept his job. Mason lost his license, his position, and almost every reference he had. He did not fight it. Anna was already sick by then, and Mason had no money for lawyers, no strength for courtrooms, and no appetite for begging powerful men to admit what they had hidden. So he disappeared into small repair work. Trucks, farm equipment, delivery vans, generators. Anything with bolts, wiring, pressure, and a customer willing to pay cash. That was how he ended up at West Bridge Executive Airfield on a Thursday morning, repairing a ground service vehicle behind Hangar 4. He was not supposed to touch jets anymore. He told himself that every time one passed. Do the job, get paid, go home. The airfield belonged mostly to people like Evelyn Hartwell, though people like Evelyn never thought of places as belonging mostly to them. They thought of them as naturally arranged around their needs. Hartwell Aviation had been built by Evelyn's grandfather, expanded by her father, and inherited by Evelyn after a boardroom fight that made business magazines call her ruthless and brilliant in the same sentence. She owned private terminals, maintenance contracts, charter fleets, and a reputation for firing anyone who slowed her down. That morning she was preparing for a flight to Denver to close a $5 million acquisition involving a custom long-range jet her company planned to showcase as the future of luxury executive travel. The jet was silver and white, freshly polished, with a cream leather cabin and a tail number that photographers loved to capture. It was more than transportation. It was a symbol. And Evelyn Hartwell protected symbols harder than people. Mason first heard the sound while replacing a fuel pump on a baggage tug. It came from across the hangar, faint beneath the whine of equipment and the echo of voices. A light, metallic chatter. Not loud, not steady. Wrong. His hand stopped on the wrench. He listened again. There it was. 3 beats, then silence. 3 beats, then silence. Mason turned his head toward Evelyn's jet. A young technician stood near the open left engine panel, wiping his hands and nodding while 2 senior engineers reviewed a tablet. Nobody looked worried. That worried Mason more. He wiped his hands on a rag and tried to return to his own work. It wasn't his aircraft. It wasn't his job. It wasn't his life anymore. Then Lily's school called. She had a fever again. Nothing severe, the nurse said, but she needed to be picked up. Mason looked at the unfinished tug, the unpaid invoice, the half-empty gas gauge in his truck, and the phone in his hand. "I'll be there," he said. He was packing his tools when the chatter came again, this time sharper. Mason looked across the hangar and saw the young technician close the engine panel. One screw did not go in. It sat on the edge of the cart, forgotten beside a rag. Mason's stomach tightened. He knew that panel. He knew that engine housing. He knew what kind of vibration could start if that panel had been opened for sensor calibration and not seated perfectly afterward. Most days a missing screw was just sloppy. On that jet, with that vibration pattern, it could become a chain. He walked over before he could talk himself out of it. "Hey," Mason called. The young technician looked up. "That panel needs to be opened again." The technician blinked. "What?" Mason pointed. "You're missing one fastener." The technician glanced at the cart, then at Mason's stained shirt. "It's fine. We're doing final walk-around." "It's not fine." One of the senior engineers turned. He was tall, clean-shaven, wearing a company vest with a polished badge and the relaxed irritation of a man interrupted by someone he considered beneath the room. "Can we help you?" Mason kept his voice respectful. "I heard chatter from the left housing. That missing screw might not seem like much, but if the bracket behind that panel is already stressed..." The engineer smiled without warmth. "You heard chatter?" "Yes." "From over there?" "Yes."
The second engineer laughed under his breath.
Mason felt heat rise in his face, but he did not step back.
Open it and check the rear bracket. The senior engineer looked him up and down. And you are? Mason Cole. I'm repairing the tug. Exactly. The engineer's smile vanished. So repair the tug. Mason glanced at the jet again. The sound had stopped. That did not comfort him. Before he could say anything else, a woman's voice cut across the hangar. Why is my departure delayed? Evelyn Hartwell entered with 2 assistants, a pilot and a man from airport operations walking half a step behind her.
Her white suit caught the hangar lights. Her heels clicked against the concrete like a countdown.
The senior engineer straightened. No delay, Miss Hartwell. Just a contractor misunderstanding his lane. Evelyn turned her eyes to Mason. In that single glance, she decided what he was. Grease on shirt. Cheap boots, old toolbox, tired face. No authority. A man to remove. Mason held her gaze. Ma'am, your left engine panel needs to be checked before takeoff. Evelyn's expression hardened. My aircraft has been inspected by certified engineers. I understand. Then why are you speaking? The hangar went quiet enough for Mason to hear Lily's school nurse calling again in his pocket. He ignored the vibration of the phone. Because something is wrong. Evelyn stepped closer. What is wrong? Mason looked at the jet, then at the engineers, then at the missing screw still sitting on the cart. I don't know all of it yet, he said, but that screw belongs in the panel, and the sound I heard means the panel may not be the only issue. The senior engineer folded his arms. This is absurd. Evelyn looked at the screw, then back at Mason. For one brief moment, something uncertain crossed her face. Then her assistant whispered, Denver board is already waiting. The uncertainty vanished. Evelyn reached into her handbag, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and held it between 2 fingers. Here, she said, for your concern. Mason did not take it. Evelyn's mouth tightened. Then she tossed the money at his feet. The $50 bill landed crooked on the concrete. For a moment, Mason simply looked at it. Not because he wanted it, because he remembered another piece of paper once placed in front of him with the same casual cruelty. Termination notice. Negligence finding. License suspended pending review. Words printed cleanly by men who had never looked him in the eye. Evelyn Hartwell mistook his silence for shame. Pick it up, she said. Then leave. The people around her watched as if the hangar had become a stage. One assistant looked embarrassed but did nothing. The pilot checked his watch. The senior engineer gave Mason a look that said the performance was over. Then Lily appeared at the side entrance. The school nurse had brought her from the small administrative office, wrapped in her pink jacket, cheeks flushed with fever. She must have seen her father from across the hangar and slipped away before anyone stopped her. Daddy? She called. Mason turned so fast his toolbox nearly tipped. His face changed instantly. The quiet mechanic vanished, and the father stepped forward. Lily, baby, what are you doing out here? She came to him slowly, eyes moving from the money on the floor to Evelyn, then to the guards. She understood more than adults wanted children to understand. One guard shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn's expression barely softened. This is a restricted area. She's sick, Mason said, stepping between Lily and everyone else. I was leaving to pick her up. Then leave. Mason bent not to pick up the 50, but to lift his daughter's backpack from her shoulder. He tucked it gently against his chest, then reached for his toolbox. The senior engineer blocked it with his shoe. You can collect that after security clears you. Mason looked at the man's polished boot resting against the battered metal box. Inside were the last good tools he had kept after selling everything else. The ratchet Anna bought him for their first Christmas. The small inspection mirror Lily used to pretend was a princess wand. The torque wrench he had refused to sell, even when rent was late. His jaw tightened once. Only once. Then he said, "Move your foot." The engineer laughed. "Or what?" Mason did not raise his voice. Or you explained to her why grown men need to step on a working man's tools to feel tall. Something in that sentence hit the room differently. The guard looked away. Lily pressed closer to Mason's leg.
Evelyn's eyes sharpened. Not with guilt, with annoyance that the room had briefly moved out of her control. "Enough," she said. "Give him his box and escort him out."
The engineer moved his foot. Mason picked up the toolbox, but before he turned, he looked one last time at the left engine panel. The missing screw on the cart was gone. His eyes narrowed. He scanned the floor near the landing gear, the edge of the inspection mat, the mechanic's tray.
Nothing. Then he noticed the young technician. The boy stood too still. One hand was clenched near his pocket.
Mason had seen that look before in men who had made mistakes, and were hoping the world moved fast enough to bury them. Evelyn turned toward the stairs. "Captain, we depart in 10 minutes. The pilot hesitated. "Miss Hartwell, perhaps we should allow one additional 10 minutes, she repeated. Her voice ended the conversation. Mason walked toward the exit with Lily beside him, but every step felt heavier than the last. He had spent 2 years telling himself that silence was safer. Silence kept food on the table. Silence kept him out of courtrooms. Silence kept Lily from hearing strangers call her father a disgraced technician. But silence also sounded like that engine. 3 beats. Then nothing. Outside the hangar, the afternoon heat hit them hard. The runway shimmered beyond the fence. Lily coughed into her sleeve. Mason opened the passenger door of his old pickup and helped her in. "Did you do something wrong?" she asked. The question cut deeper than Evelyn's money. Mason leaned one arm on the doorframe. "No," he said. "Then why were they mean?" He looked back at the hangar. Through the open doors, he could see people moving around the jet with forced confidence. Rich guests were arriving now, stepping from black cars, holding phones, smiling for cameras. Evelyn Hartwell stood near the stairs, the center of all motion, a woman surrounded by people paid to agree with her. "Sometimes," Mason said carefully, "people are scared of being wrong. So they get angry at whoever notices." Lily studied him. "Are you scared?" Mason smiled a little, but it did not reach his eyes. "Every day." "Of what?" He brushed a strand of hair away from her warm forehead. "Of not being enough for you." Lily frowned as if that was the stupidest thing she had ever heard. "You're my dad." That was all she said, and somehow it steadied him more than any medal, license, or title ever had. Mason got into the driver's seat, started the truck, and pulled toward the service road. He told himself to go home, get Lily medicine, make soup, call the tug owner and apologize for leaving early. Forget the jet, forget Evelyn Hartwell, forget the sound. Then the truck passed the maintenance bay window. Inside, on a rolling tray near a trash bin, Mason saw something that made his foot press the brake. A screw. Not just any screw. The missing one. It had a faint crescent scrape along the head, as if someone had tried to force it with the wrong bit. Mason could see it clearly even from the truck because sunlight hit the metal at the exact angle. He stared. The screw had not been forgotten. It had been removed from view. Lily noticed his face. "Daddy?" Mason pulled the truck to the side and killed the engine. "Stay here," he said. "But lock the door. I'll be right there." He stepped out and crossed toward the maintenance bay, keeping his pace calm. His heart had begun to beat with the old rhythm, the one he used to feel before difficult inspections, when a machine told him something was wrong but the paperwork insisted everything was fine. Inside the bay, the young technician stood near the tray, speaking in a low voice to the senior engineer. Mason stopped outside the half-open door. He heard only pieces. "He saw it. Doesn't matter. Hartwell wants departure." Then the senior engineer said something that made Mason's blood run cold. "Put another one in after Denver. Nobody opens that panel now." Mason stepped into the doorway. Both men turned. The young technician went pale. The senior engineer's face hardened. "You were told to leave." Mason pointed at the screw on the tray. "That fastener came out of Miss Hartwell's jet." "No, it didn't. It has fresh torque damage. You don't know what you're looking at." Mason moved closer, slowly enough not to look threatening, but firmly enough that neither man mistook his intent. I know exactly what I'm looking at.
The senior engineer stepped in front of the tray. You are not licensed on this aircraft. You are not assigned to this crew. You are not authorized to make any claim. Mason's eyes moved past him to the young technician.
What did you hear when you closed the panel?
The boy swallowed.
Nothing.
Mason waited. The boy's eyes flicked toward the hangar. That was the answer. The senior engineer snapped. He said nothing. Mason leaned down and picked up a clean rag from a nearby bench. He used it to lift the screw without touching it directly. The senior engineer lunged, but Mason stepped back. Give me that.
No.
You're stealing company property. Mason held the screw and the rag, his face calm now in a way that made the engineer more nervous than anger would have.
If I'm wrong,
Mason said, you can have me arrested in front of everyone. The engineer's nostrils flared.
And if you're right?
Mason looked toward the hangar, where Evelyn Hartwell's guests were boarding a $5 million jet with champagne glasses in their hands.
If I'm right, he said, you're about to send a plane into the sky with a loose vibration path near the left engine housing.
The young technician whispered.
It was only one screw.
Mason turned to him.
No, he said. It's never only one screw when somebody hides it.
The young technician looked as if he wanted to disappear into the floor. Mason saw the fear in him before the guilt. That mattered. Guilty men usually defended themselves too fast. Scared men waited for permission to tell the truth. The senior engineer stepped closer, lowering his voice.
Listen to me carefully. You walk away now, and maybe I don't report you for trespassing and theft.
Mason folded the rag over the screw and slipped it into his shirt pocket.
Report me.
The engineer's eyes flashed.
Mason turned to the young technician. What's your name?
The boy hesitated.
Cal, he said.
Cal, the senior engineer snapped.
Mason ignored him.
Did that screw come from the left engine access panel?
Cal's lips parted. For 1 second, the truth stood right there in his face.
Then the engineer answered for him.
No.
Mason nodded slowly, as if that was exactly what he expected.
Then you won't mind opening the panel again?
The senior engineer gave a short laugh.
You really don't understand how this world works, do you?
Mason looked at him.
I understand machines. That's enough today.
He walked out of the maintenance bay before the engineer could block him. Behind him, Cal whispered,
Sir?
Mason stopped. Cal's voice shook.
I heard it too.
The words were small, almost swallowed by the hangar noise. But Mason heard them. The senior engineer turned on him.
Shut your mouth.
Cal flinched. Mason stepped back inside.
What did you hear?
Cal looked down at his hands. A chatter, like a loose washer but deeper.
Tiếp phần 6/6, kết thúc toàn bộ kịch bản tác.
After the panel closed? Cal nodded. Before or after the sensor reset? The boy's eyes lifted quickly. That was the question no random repairman should have known to ask.
After,
Cal said. Mason's stomach tightened.
The senior engineer pointed toward the exit.
Both of you are finished. Mason looked at the older man's badge. Name, Grant Voss. He remembered that name. Not from Westbridge. From 2 years ago. Grant Voss had worked for the same contractor that signed off on the luxury charter Mason warned them not to release. He had not been the supervisor in charge, but his name had appeared twice in the maintenance chain. Once on a calibration report, once on a replacement parts authorization. Back then, Mason had been too buried in grief to chase every signature. Now the name stood in front of him, wearing authority like a stolen coat. Mason's voice dropped.
You were with Northline Aviation.
Grant's face changed by a fraction. Not enough for most people.
Enough for Mason.
I've worked many places, Grant said. So have bad parts. Grant smiled, but his jaw tightened. Careful. Mason turned and walked faster now, not toward the exit, but toward the main hangar. Lily was still in the truck. He could see her through the glass, watching him with worry. Every instinct told him to go to her, but beyond the truck, through the open hangar doors, Evelyn Hartwell was climbing the jet stairs. The pilots were preparing for departure. The guests were already inside. Mason pulled out his phone and called airport operations.
A receptionist answered with bored efficiency. Westbridge Executive Airfield. This is Mason Cole. I'm reporting a possible mechanical hazard on Hartwell jet tail number. Sir, are you authorized crew? No, but... Then you need to speak with your contracting supervisor. There may be a compromised engine access panel. Please hold. The line clicked into music. Mason stared at the phone. Of course. Systems did not fail only because people lied. They failed because people built little walls around responsibility until truth could not get through in time. He hung up and called again, this time emergency field safety. No answer. He looked toward the control office. Then he saw Evelyn through the jet window, seated near the front cabin, speaking sharply into her phone. Her face showed impatience, not fear. She had built a life around certainty, and certainty had made her deaf. Mason stepped onto the polished hangar floor. A security guard moved to intercept him. Sir, you need to leave. Mason held up both hands. Call your airfield safety officer. We've been told to remove you. Then remove me after you call him. The guard hesitated. Mason looked him straight in the eye. There's a child in my truck. I'm not here to make trouble. The guard's expression shifted slightly. Before he could answer, Grant Voss stormed from the maintenance bay. Get him out now. That decided the guard. He reached for Mason's arm. Mason did not fight. He only raised his voice, loud enough for the pilots near the stairs to hear. Do not start that left engine. The chief pilot turned. Evelyn appeared at the aircraft door, furious now. What did I just say about removing him? Mason pulled the rag from his pocket and opened it. The screw sat in his palm under the hangar lights. You are missing a fastener from the left engine access panel, he said. It has fresh torque damage, and your technician heard chatter after sensor reset. Grant laughed. That screw could be from anything. Mason looked at him. Then why did you hide it? The hangar went silent. Evelyn's eyes moved from Mason to Grant. For the first time, the certainty in her face cracked. Grant recovered quickly. This man is unstable. He has a grudge against aviation maintenance because he was removed from the industry for negligence. There it was, the old accusation, dropped in public like a weapon. Several heads turned. Mason felt it hit him, but he did not let it show. Lily was watching from the truck. He would not let her see him shrink. Evelyn folded her arms. Is that true? Mason answered calmly. I was blamed for a failure I warned against. Grant stepped closer. You were suspended. Yes. For signing off on a faulty aircraft. Mason looked at him. I never signed it. Grant's smile thinned. The record says otherwise. Mason turned to Evelyn. Ask him to show you the panel. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Captain? The chief pilot looked trapped between money and instinct. Pilots knew fear differently from executives. They lived by checklists because gravity did not care who owned the aircraft. He said carefully. A visual recheck would take 5 minutes. Grant snapped. We already cleared departure. The pilot did not look at him. He looked at Evelyn. Miss Hartwell, if there is even a question, my Denver meeting starts in 40 minutes, she said. Mason stepped forward, still held lightly by the guard. Cancel the meeting. Evelyn stared at him as if he had slapped her. What did you say? Cancel the meeting, open the panel, check the rear bracket. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize in front of everyone, hand you back the $50, and never set foot on this airfield again. Grant laughed. How noble! Mason looked at him. If I'm right, he said, you tell them what happened 2 years ago. Grant's face went flat. Evelyn caught it, so did the pilot. So did Cal, standing pale near the maintenance bay door. The air in the hangar changed. Evelyn descended 2 steps from the aircraft, her heels clicking slowly. What happened 2 years ago? Grant answered too fast. Nothing relevant. Mason said, a jet was released after a vibration warning. My notes disappeared. A rushed parts replacement got signed off under my ID. Evelyn's gaze sharpened. Under your ID? I lost my license. Someone else kept flying. Grant pointed at him. This is slander. Mason held up the screw. No, this is a pattern. A phone camera began recording from somewhere behind the guests, then another. Evelyn noticed. Her public life had taught her to sense cameras like weather. Her face hardened again, not with cruelty this time, but with calculation.
"Open the panel,"
she ordered. Grant turned. "Ms. Hartwell, now!" For the first time since Mason had entered the hangar, Grant Voss had no immediate answer. Two mechanics rolled the ladder toward the left engine. Cal followed with a toolkit, hands shaking. The pilot came down from the stairs. Evelyn stood near the nose of the jet, arms crossed, eyes locked on Mason as though she still wanted him to be wrong. Mason wanted to be wrong too.
Because if he was right, the problem was no longer one missing screw.
Cal removed the panel. The moment it came loose, a faint metallic click echoed inside the housing. Every face turned toward the sound. Mason closed his eyes briefly. There it was. 3 beats, then silence. The pilot whispered, "What the hell was that?" Mason opened his eyes. "Rear bracket," he said. Cal reached inside with a flashlight, his face drained of color. Grant took 1 step backward. Evelyn saw it. "What is it?" she demanded. Cal looked at Mason first, then at the pilot. "There's a fracture," he said, "and the dampener bolt is backed out halfway." The pilot moved fast now, climbing the ladder himself. Grant said, "That's impossible." Mason looked at him. "No," he said, "that's expensive." "No," Mason said, "that's expensive." Nobody laughed. The words sat in the hangar heavier than an accusation. The chief pilot had both hands braced against the open engine housing, his face pale under the inspection light. Cal stood beside him, holding the flashlight so tightly his fingers trembled. Evelyn Hartwell was no longer standing like a woman annoyed by delay. She was standing like a woman who had just realized the floor under her empire could crack. "What does that mean?" she asked. Mason walked closer, stopping just below the ladder. "It means this wasn't wear from age," he said. "That bracket was stressed after the dampener bolt backed out. The panel chatter was the warning. If the panel had stayed closed and the engine spooled up, vibration would have traveled through the housing." The pilot swallowed. "In flight?" Mason looked at him. "You'd feel it on climb." The pilot closed his eyes for 1 second. The guests inside the jet began unbuckling. One by one, they came down the stairs, no longer annoyed, no longer smiling, no longer holding champagne like this was a luxury inconvenience. They looked at the open engine like it had become a mouth telling the truth. Evelyn turned to Grant Voss. "Why didn't your inspection catch this?" Grant's face was still controlled, but his eyes were moving too quickly. "It was not present during inspection." Mason said, "It was." Grant snapped, "You don't know that." Mason pointed to the screw in his rag. "Fresh torque damage, wrong bit." Someone removed it, realized the panel wouldn't seat clean, heard chatter, then tried to bury the fastener until after departure. Cal's breath shook. Grant looked at him sharply. Evelyn saw it. "Cal," she said. The young technician looked like a boy now, not a mechanic. "I didn't know the bracket was fractured. That is not what I asked." Cal stared at the floor. "I heard the chatter after we closed the panel. Mr. Voss said the jet was cleared and not to reopen it." Grant stepped forward. "He is inexperienced." Cal's voice broke. "You took the screw off my tray." The hangar went dead silent. Phones were raised now. Guests, crew, airport staff. Not for gossip anymore. For protection. Everyone knew they were watching something money could not easily erase. Evelyn's face changed. It was not regret yet. It was rage with nowhere safe to land. "Open the maintenance log," she ordered. Grant stiffened. "Miss Hartwell, this is not the proper—" "Open it." An assistant hurried forward with the tablet. The pilot climbed down and stood beside Evelyn as the digital log loaded. For several seconds, only the hum of hangar lights filled the space. Then the pilot's brow tightened. "This dampener assembly was replaced yesterday." Mason looked up. "By who?" The assistant scrolled. Grant reached for the tablet. "That is internal documentation." Evelyn pulled it away from him. Her eyes scanned the screen.
Then she looked at Mason. "It says final clearance by Grant Voss." Mason nodded once, slowly. Grant's voice sharpened. "That is standard. I supervise the work." Mason stepped closer to the engine, studying the exposed bracket under the light. "Where did the part come from?" Grant said nothing. The pilot looked at the tablet again. "Vendor code is blank." "That's impossible," Evelyn said. Mason's expression remained calm, but his voice carried to every person in the hangar. "No, that's how bad parts enter good planes." Evelyn turned to Grant. "Tell me you didn't install an undocumented part on my aircraft." Grant's mouth opened. Nothing came out. And in that silence, Evelyn Hartwell finally understood the man she had thrown money at had not been trying to embarrass her. He had been trying to save her. Mason said, "2 years ago, a charter went down after a rushed vibrations sign-off. My notes about the sound disappeared. A replacement part was entered under my ID after I had already clocked out." Grant's face hardened. "You cannot prove that." Mason looked at Cal. "Maybe not alone." Cal's eyes lifted. Mason continued. "But this time there are cameras. There are witnesses. There is a hidden screw, a fractured bracket, a blank vendor code, and a technician who heard the warning before you told him to ignore it." Evelyn's assistant whispered, "The old Northine archive may still exist. Hartwell acquired their service contracts last year." Grant turned toward her. "Do not touch those files." That was enough. Evelyn held out her hand. "Give me the tablet." The assistant obeyed. Evelyn did not look away from Grant as she spoke to security. "Mr. Voss is not to leave this hangar." Grant laughed once, but it came out thin. "You're making a mistake." Evelyn's voice dropped. "No, I already made one." Security moved in. Grant tried to step back, then stopped when he realized everyone was watching. Mason did not smile. He did not look triumphant. He only turned toward the truck outside where Lily sat behind the glass, both hands pressed to the window. Evelyn followed his gaze. For the first time all day, she looked at the child before she looked at the problem. Then she looked down at the concrete. The $50 bill was still there, half folded by the wind. Evelyn walked to it. Everyone watched as she bent down and picked it up herself. Her white suit brushed against the dirty floor. When she stood, the room had changed again. She walked to Mason, holding the bill not like payment now, but like evidence of her shame. "I was wrong," she said. Mason said nothing. Evelyn's voice grew quieter. "I judged you by your shirt, your toolbox, and my own impatience. I humiliated you in front of your daughter." Mason looked at her then. That was the part that mattered. Not the money, not the jet, not even the license. His daughter had seen it. Evelyn understood. She turned toward the hangar, toward the guests, crew, mechanics, assistants, and cameras. "Mr. Cole warned us before anyone else did. This aircraft is grounded because he had the courage to speak after I gave him every reason to stay silent." The pilot stepped forward. "He stopped this flight," he said. "No question." Cal nodded, tears standing in his eyes. "He did." Evelyn faced Mason again. "I want Hartwell Aviation's legal team to reopen the Northline incident. Full records, independent review. If your ID was used falsely, it will be corrected publicly." Mason's throat tightened, but he kept his voice steady.
"I don't want a performance."
"You won't get one."
"I don't want pity."
Evelyn folded the $50 bill once, then placed it on the nearby workbench instead of offering it to him. "No," she said. "You deserve respect." Mason looked at the bill, then at the open engine. "My daughter needs medicine," he said, "and I need to finish the tug repair before I lose the job." A strange expression crossed Evelyn's face, as if she had never heard a man stand in the middle of a $5 million crisis and still worry about an unpaid repair. She turned to her assistant. "Pay his invoice." "Today. Triple it. Then call a doctor for his daughter." Mason immediately shook his head. "I didn't ask for that." "I know," Evelyn said. "That's why I'm offering it correctly." He studied her for a long moment. Then he said,
Pay the original invoice. Send the doctor if Lily needs one. Reopen the record because it's right, not because you feel bad. Evelyn lowered her eyes. Yes. By sunset, the jet remained grounded. Federal inspectors were on their way. Hartwell Aviation suspended Grant Voss, pending investigation. By the next week, the Northline files were pulled from archive, and a digital timestamp proved what Mason had said for 2 years. His warning notes had been removed after submission, and his ID had been used on a clearance he never approved. The correction came quietly at first, then publicly. Not because Mason demanded cameras, because Evelyn Hartwell stood before them and said his name, not as a disgraced mechanic, as the man who stopped her jet from flying, damaged. Months later, Mason received his license reinstatement letter in the mail. He opened it at the kitchen table while Lily ate cereal across from him. For a long time, he just stared at the page. Lily leaned forward. "Does it say you can fix planes again?" Mason smiled, eyes wet. "It says they finally remembered I could." Hartwell Aviation offered him a senior safety position. He did not accept right away. He took 3 days, fixed 2 trucks, replaced a church generator, and walked Lily to school each morning like always. When he finally returned to Westbridge, he did not wear a new suit. He wore clean work clothes, carried the same old toolbox, and kept the restored license folded inside the lid. Evelyn met him at the hangar entrance. No sunglasses, no entourage. Just her. "I never apologized to Lily," she said. Mason looked toward his daughter, who stood beside him holding his hand. Evelyn crouched to Lily's height. "I treated your father badly," she said. "I was wrong." Lily studied her with serious eyes. Then she said, "He told me people get angry when they're scared of being wrong." Evelyn smiled sadly. "Your father was right." Lily nodded. "He usually is." Mason laughed softly, and for the first time in years the sound did not carry exhaustion. Inside the hangar, the repaired jet waited under new inspection lights. Every panel had been checked, every part traced, every shortcut documented and removed. Evelyn asked Mason, "Would it fly?" Mason listened. Not to the executives, not to the schedule, not to the pressure, to the machine. The engine hummed steady. No chatter, no hidden warning, no 3 beats followed by silence. He looked at Lily, then back at Evelyn. "Yes," he said. "Now it can fly." And this time, when the jet rolled toward the runway, the man everyone had tried to throw out stood at the center of the hangar, not as a hero demanding applause, but as a father who had taught his daughter the only lesson that had survived every loss. Walk tall, especially when people don't see you.